Hey guys, welcome to yet another Fanfic Friday, a series where we write and read out aloud, for some reason, our fanfictions. The fanfics are written based on a series of characters, locations, and scenarios that we have put into 3 different hats, and a lot of times we end up using suggestions that you guys have given us, because we put in each different category at random and draw them out, and then we have half an hour to write the story based on those suggestions. This week, we're actually at MomoCon in Atlanta, Georgia, so if you're watching this right now, and you're going to MomoCon, because if you weren't going to MomoCon before, I think it's going to be a bit late in the day to go now. We're going to be doing a Fanfic Friday at the panels that I'm doing this weekend, so please come to that, and you'll be able to suggest things live, and I'll be writing a fanfiction based on your in-person suggestions. And if you're not at MomoCon, we'll put that fanfiction online in the account, the archive of our own account that we have linked in the description. So check that out as well if you want to see an archive of all the fanfictions that we write both here and off the video series in real life. So yeah, without further ado, here's our first fanfic.
The following fanfics are based on existing properties. We do not own the rights to the characters or the locations associated with them. These stories are intended to be non-profit and are written for fun only. Each author was randomly assigned 2 characters, a location, and a scenario. Each contestant was given 30 minutes to finish their story. What follows is the shocking results.
Hello again. It is Friday, and you know what that means. It's time for Fanfic Friday. My picks for this week were Levi, who I fucking hate from Attack on Titan, and George Lucas, suggested by Ken the Noun. The location is the desert, and the scenario is being nostalgic about the 90s, so I figured George Lucas was a perfect candidate for that. Thank you, Ken the Noun. As previously mentioned 2 seconds ago, I fucking hate Levi, so you might see a couple of references to that in the prose. Maybe, I don't know. We'll find out together. Levi heaved a heavy sigh, wiping at his ugly eyebrows with the back of his hand as he squinted his already squished eyes against the glare of the sun. The sand sizzled as the heat radiated off the earth's surface, the horizon glistening with the promise of water that didn't actually exist. Levi turned in its direction regardless, shuffling away from the burning wreckage of his land vehicle in the hopes of finding civilization. And cut! A bell rang, signaling the end of the take, and people rushed in with extinguishers to eliminate the smoldering flames of his prop speeder. Did we get it? Levi asked, shielding his eyes as he looked at the director, who was none other than the legendary George Lucas. Yeah, it's done. Go have a seat while we set up the next shot. Levi nodded and trotted over to a small tent that had been assigned to him. Ducking under the flap, Levi plopped in a stiff, uncomfortable chair that was immune to the curse of sand that seemed to get everywhere. Ruffling his ugly bangs, Levi closed his eyes, and everyone reading this heaved a sigh of relief because they didn't have to picture them anymore, because Levi's eyes were the second worst feature that he had. The first is his eyebrows. Ever since humanity had won the war against the Titans, technology and entertainment grew at an alarming pace. In just a decade, the humans trapped behind the multiple walls had made contact with those living outside of it, on other continents who had remained untouched by the devastation that the Titans had brought. Namely, Americans, who, when they came to visit the walled kingdom, brought with them things like phones, cameras, cars, and a plethora of other conveniences. Star Wars was one of these conveniences, and it ripped through their culture like a wildfire so passionately that the kingdom had hired George Lucas himself to make a 3rd trilogy, separate from The Force Awakens, set entirely in the settings available within the walls. As George Lucas was a large fan of Levi's record as a Titan Slayer, and as it was legally impossible for a protagonist in an anime to be over the age of 16, by the time Lucas was casting, Levi was still young enough to play the scrappy lead. Levi didn't know how good of an actor he was. He was terrible. But it involved an easy way to make money that didn't involve murdering people of any size. The flap to his tent shuddered open once again, revealing the director himself behind it. Mind if I come in for a minute? Lucas asked, and Levi nodded once as he rubbed a cool bottle of water on the back of his neck. George sat across from him in the other similarly uncomfortable cloth chair present in the structure. I tell you, man, Lucas sighed as he grabbed a bottle for himself from the cooler lying at his feet. I am so glad to be back in the saddle for this one. When they didn't ask me to come back for The Force Awakens, it really burned me up. Levi grunted in response. He hadn't seen any of these movies because he was an idiot, so he didn't particularly have a strong opinion about them. Maybe if they were on trial, he would kick them into submission for no real reason, but other than that, he didn't really care. Everyone just wants to define me by the Phantom Menace, George continued, without paying attention to Levi, which was the best way to live life in this author's humble opinion. They don't understand just how much work went into it, how many hours we spent perfecting the design of locations and characters and weapons. It was a huge undertaking. And our work with Jar Jar was some of the most advanced, groundbreaking stuff ever done in film at the time. You kids are spoiled with your Smeagol's. Ahmed Best didn't have people like Andy Serkis to look at for inspiration. I don't know what an Andy Serkis or a Smeagol is, Levi said flatly. Lucas ignored him. Good on you, George. And Andy does good work, don't get me wrong. But Ahmed laid that groundwork for him, and he gets nothing for it aside from ridicule. And I don't get anything aside from ridicule. George Lucas sat back in his chair, taking a long swig of water while Levi silently watched him with no real interest in anything he had to say. Or maybe it just looked that way because Levi always looks stupid and miserable. When I sold the rights to Star Wars, I thought I'd just sit back and let the money make itself and let all the fans squabble over other people's failed attempts at my creative vision. Lucas wiped a bit of sweat from the top of his upper lip. But I'm glad you guys have given me a new chance with this. I think it's going to be real big. Bigger than The Force Awakens, even. Why was it sleeping in the first place? Levi asked. Lucas continued to ignore him. They'll see they were wrong. What's this one called? Levi asked. And for once, George Lucas responded. Star Wars 7. The Ewoks fucked the Gungans. I don't know what either of those are. Son, when this movie is over, you'll wish you never had. The end. I'm sorry. I like The Phantom Menace. I know it's a shitty movie. I mean, it's not a shitty movie, it's just boring. But it's cool. George Lucas is not a very good director.
This week, the characters I got were Furiosa from Mad Max Fury Road, which was one of our suggestions, and the other character was Mona from Nanolan, which was suggested by Ash Taylor, Tailor, and I didn't know who that was at first, but I have seen the various clips from Nanolan, and we figured out that it was the little girl, the main character, the protagonist of Nanolan. So that's who was hanging out with Furiosa. The location is inside the TARDIS, which was suggested by Donovan Bassold. I believe I'm pronouncing it completely wrong, but Donovan Bassold? I don't know. And the scenario, which I treated kind of loosely, although it is featured in the story, is a gunfight at dawn, suggested by Silver Salamence ID. I think that's a Pokemon reference. The TARDIS bucked and whined almost musically through the innumerable dimensions of temporal space as Furiosa guided it. Or rather, she believed she was guiding it. And while a great many of her firmly held beliefs had recently proven to have far weaker foundations than she had known, this was different. For one, Furiosa had always been able to handle a vehicle. If something had wheels and an engine, it was practically second nature to her. Something like instinct always kicked in, allowed her to hold a steady course through even the worst sandstorms. A raw, unconscious relationship always developed between her and her transport, though none had fought her quite like this one. "Did you stabilize the shields?" she cried out to the small felt companion who had joined her on this trek through the fabric of time. The man who had loaned her this strange oblong time machine had told her that traveling with a companion was crucial when it came to time travel shenanigans. Apparently sexual tensions weren't a must, but it was a bonus. Furiosa rather doubted there would be any sparks flying between her and her animated puppet friend. "Mona, do you hear me?" Somewhere in the inner workings of the TARDIS, Mona, a small, poorly designed puppet girl, regretted her decision to leave her nan's house where it was safe and warm so she could play with Russell all day if it so pleased her. The strange, bald lady with the metal arm had made it sound so exhilarating, going on this adventure. She was going to travel forward through time and plant a bunch of trees, but not just trees, every kind of seed she could get her hand on, too. But first they had to deal with the fact that they had flown straight into some sort of temporal storm that was causing them to be thrown way off course. "Oh, Gashusha!" Mona cried out over the painful ripping and buckling sounds emanating from the TARDIS's hull. She held out a furry green finger and poked at a console that displayed the craft's various colorful conditions in a handy bar chart format. The shields were an unpleasant red color. "The hull integrity go... Oh no! Russia! Russia!" "We don't have time to go back for your dog," Furiosa barked. "If we don't get those seeds back to my time, we won't be able to rebuild the green place. All plant life in the future is extremely limited due to the whole apocalypse thing." "Who kill the world? Mona asked curiously. Good question. Furiosa leaned back, tendons in her neck growing visibly taut as she yanked back on one of the many random and seemingly ineffectual levers that dotted the TARDIS's controls. She had traveled back from her time in a desperate attempt to fix things. The TARDIS seemed to have a will and a mind of its own, and had taken her to Mona's nan's garden, where she had found this young puppet child teaching her dog the names of the various fruits and vegetables that could be found there. She'd seemed like as good a choice as anyone to bring life back to a dead world. Furiosa had wished she'd spent the maybe 10 extra minutes it would have taken to find a slightly better candidate. If you can get the shields back online, we can make a safe landing. I hope. Furiosa was mostly speaking gobbledygook, which was another important part of the whole time travel kit and caboodle, as the wild-eyed fellow who owned this blue box had informed her. The Doctor, as he had referred to himself, had stayed behind in Furiosa's timeline as their companion, an attractive young blonde woman named after a flower. Which one was it again? Furiosa could hardly bring herself to remember. Had wanted to see what the end of the world looked like. The blonde girl had complained vocally, saying it looked just like Scarborough Pleasure Beach without all the chavs. Furiosa hadn't understood a word, but imagined if she had, she'd have been rather offended on behalf of her dead planet. The Shisha on good time now, Mona announced meaninglessly, and Furiosa felt the TARDIS's movement slow down to a crawl. Sweat poured down her stress-knotted brow, and she took loud breaths as she wrenched down on one of the larger levers available. She nodded as the noise of their moving turned into a low, self-satisfied hum. The TARDIS was in neutral. Mona sprang out from behind the TARDIS's main console, her legs just out of shot. Or rather, out of sight. TARDIS go whoosh! Yes, TARDIS go whoosh, Furiosa echoed Mona's sentiment, turning her attention to the exit. She had sat at the helm of many a transport. However, even driving the war rig had proven to be like shooting fish in a barrel compared to manipulating the veritable bronco that was the Doctor's means of transportation. Let's see what's out there. Mona and Furiosa stepped out into the burning heat of the desert. A white-hot sun stared unblinking at them, forcing Furiosa to shield her eyes and try to make out their surroundings through the cracks in her metal digits. In front of her, a man stood with his back to her, his hair wild, beard unkempt, a half-eaten two-headed lizard still crammed in his mouth. His hands had been busy, however, and his attention had been stirred by the cacophonous arrival of the blue police box that now stood upon the sand dune behind him. In his left hand he held the headless remains of his morning snack. In his right, a revolver that was more rust than weapon at this point. He turned and aimed it at her. "Hold," he grunted. "Oh, the people!" Mona cried, pointing at the gun in the stranger's hand. "Don't be afraid," Furiosa commanded the two of them. She raised both hands in the air and nodded to Mona to do the same. She took a step toward the armed wild man and strung her words with compassion the way she had learned from an old friend. "We've come to make things right. What's your name?" The stranger stared blankly at her, as though her words were not in his tongue. He licked his lips, eyes twitching from Furiosa to Mona, then back again. "Max. My name is Max." Furiosa's jaw slackened and she froze in mid-step. This was her old friend. This was, indeed, Max. But it was a good several days before they were supposed to meet. Furiosa stood with a migraine the size of the time paradox she'd just caused, trying to figure it out. Meanwhile, Mona set about planting a field of strawberries in the middle of nowhere. "Oh, the shoosh and the people! Oh, what a lovely day!" she whispered to herself as she did so. The end.
All right, this week I got Xavier Woods, which was recommended by Trigun Kwan. I got Tilly, Martin and Marianne's dog, in Wonderland trying to lift Thor's hammer. After having fallen through the hole down to Wonderland, Xavier Woods was quite surprised that he was no longer at ringside, dancing along with his friends Kofi and Big E. All he remembers prior to the tumble down the hole is dancing provocatively and playing the trombone while going to get another trombone out from under the curtain for a trombone wedding. He had even worn his fancy unicorn horn that day with a bow tie positioned at the bottom. "I can't miss this trombone wedding," Xavier cried in a huff. "I've already paid the planners and was even made best man. Francesca II would kill me if I missed the big day." He looked around and found everything around him was quite off. Everything seemed rather normal and slightly askew at the same time. Xavier dashed off down the most well-walked path and followed signs that said exit. While running, he came across flowers that were singing in a circle, with something obviously in the middle of them.
Looking past the fact that flowers could talk, as he figured this might be Wonderland, he approached to see what all the fuss was about under the guise of asking directions. He knew Wonderland was notorious for leading you astray, and figured it would be best to ask to be sure. When he got near enough, the flowers all stared at him with a bit more judgment in their eyes than he was expecting. "Excuse me, but I was wondering if you could tell me how to get out of here." "Out," he says. "Well, I'd just as well fancy someone moving this massive man-tool out of our midst. If you can get it away from our delicate and fragile frames without injuring anything with a massive oafish body of yours, then I suppose we could help." "I would appreciate that greatly, ladies," he said with a gentlemanly bow. Upon coming closer, Xavier laid eyes on the task ahead of him and groaned heavily. "Man, you gotta be kidding me!" In the center of the brightly colored flowers was Thor's hammer laying on its side, looking far less intimidating sitting amongst flowers. "If I can go to Wonderland underneath the ring, there's a good chance that actually belongs to Thor. How am I going to pull this off? The wedding is probably about to start." He sighed and thought that there may be a chance there's enough good in him to move it inch by inch until it's out of the flowers. But then there came the issue of destroying the flowers in its path, and he figured he wouldn't be able to fold so much as a petal while removing it. "Well, I'll just have to try my best," he said, rubbing his hands together. "If you would be so kind as to move back as far as your roots will allow," he said, his eyes lingering on a pink rose that blushed to a dark red as the flowers started to sway outward. There was just enough room for him to gain his footing around the hammer, and like so many days at the gym beforehand, he was standing in proper form to do a squat that would hopefully help him raise the massive weight. His body was poised and ready to lift Mjolnir from its patch of dirt on the ground, and as he grasped the hammer, he pulled with all of his strength, but to no avail. I was hoping this would be a fluke, but it looks like it's going to be more complicated than that. Xavier hopped out of the ring of flowers and looked over the hammer again, knowing that he wouldn't be able to move it. Normally I would try and find other options, but I know I won't be able to move that. "I'm sorry," Xavier said with a sigh. "Quitter," a voice from behind him barked. He turned and was surprised to find a small tan Chiweenie pit bull dog trotting up to the flower bed. With a small bound, the dog hopped over the flowers and looked back at Xavier. "Before you ask, my name is Tilly. I fell between the seat cushions in my home and ended up here. I'm assuming there's some sort of dimensional tears that are happening. Looking at this hammer tells me my thoughts on the matter are confirmed," she said, eyeing over the hammer. "How do you know what that is? Aren't you just a dog in the real world?" Xavier asked, starting to feel a bit of shock overtaking him that he may actually be stuck in another dimension, letting his friend down on her very special day. "I'm a lapdog. If you don't think I've watched at least one Thor movie in my lifetime, you're kidding yourself. I have to get back, Tilly. I can help you with whatever this is right after the main event, but not right now." He was willing to go on an action-packed adventure with a talking dog, but not at the expense of Francesca II's wedding. Tilly eyed him carefully. "We may not need your help regardless, but I understand wanting to be there for your friend, even if she is a trombone," Tilly said with a wrinkly dog smile. She picked up the hammer in her mouth as easily as if it were a stick. "How can you do that?" Xavier asked with some measure of surprise. "I'm a dog. We have no inherent good or evil, so I'm a neutral party. Besides, me and Molly go way back." Xavier figured that there was no point in arguing with the logic, and then remembered he had somewhere to be. "So how do I get out of here?" he asked. "The exit signs were a safe bet, and you're only about 20 feet away from a dimensional rift out of here. I have to take this to SHIELD HQ, but I'll walk you out," Tilly said as she escorted the wrestler to the door. "Until we meet again, Mr. Woods. Until we meet again, Mr. Woods. I hope the wedding today is beautiful." She stood on her hind legs and saluted him as he walked through the portal. Dog speed, Xavier Woods.
Thanks for watching Fanfic Friday, and remember to leave your suggestions in the comment box below, either a character, a location, or a scenario, and we will put them in the hat if we recognize it. If none of us know what it is, we probably won't end up doing it. But if it works and we know what it is, we'll put it in the hat or the bag or whatever we use. I've lost track of it at this point. And you might get drawn, and we will mention you in the fanfiction video when we use it. So go ahead, it's fun. See you next week.